Hi, hope you guys are doing well. It's been a while, but I'm finally back. It's time to talk about HBO's plans for a cinematic universe. And in this video, that is exactly what we're gonna do. House of the Dragon Season 1 is over, and it definitely exceeded many people's expectations. A huge amount of people out there believed the franchise to be dead and gone after the catastrophic response to the final season of Game of Thrones, but HBO proved that this franchise is still very much alive. HBO was very quick to order a second season of House of the Dragon, but it doesn't stop there. We know that HBO is also working on a cinematic universe. So far, there are at least 4 spin-off shows in active development at HBO. An animated show about Yeti, a Corlys Velaryon spin-off show about his infamous 9 voyages, a Duncan Egg show, and of course a sequel show about Jon Snow. These are all separate shows, but Ryan Condal, showrunner of House of the Dragon, had something very interesting to say. I love Westeros. I love George's world. I would love to be involved with it, as long as he and HBO will have me. It's hard to think about where things could go. The show is called House of the Dragon. It's not called The Dance of the Dragons. It's about the Targaryen dynasty in all of its forms. It's about the Targaryen house, really. And I think there's many fascinating periods to be told there. I think now we're telling the story of this large civil war that happens when both sides have dragons. I think it would be fascinating to also explore a time when Targaryens are still in power but don't have any dragons. How do they then threaten their enemies? And how would the whole strategy of war change? There are a lot of places to go. Seems like House of the Dragon might become an anthology series after all. There was a time when many of us thought that this show would start with Aegon the Conqueror, and even though it would have been awesome to start with the Conquest, it was wise to start with the Dance. It of course has a lot of action, lots of dragons, lots of infamous battles and characters. It was the peak of the Targaryen dynasty. It was also all about showing the people how it was back then and to establish House Targaryen in television. It was the safest option and the one George R. R. Martin kept pushing ever since there were talks about a Game of Thrones spin-off show. But it also opened the door for many more shows about the Targaryens, or rather seasons about the Targaryens. In this video, I want to focus on a few segments of the Targaryen history that could be turned into a television show. I won't include Duncan Egg as it seems like this is a separate thing, but we're definitely going to talk about that very soon. So for now, let's focus on House of the Dragon. Let's start with the very first show, House of the Dragon Rebellion. Going for the Blackfyre Rebellions probably makes the most sense from a corporate point of view. As Condal mentioned, it would show the Targaryens without their dragons, and that alone shakes up the entire power dynamics. It's a different kind of war. Yes, it's all about the succession again, but that is what most of the audience is here for. The best thing about a Blackfyre Rebellion show is once again the complexity of its characters. It would be filled with plenty of very colorful characters. People would of course choose sides between House Targaryen and House Blackfyre, similarly to how it's slowly starting with greens and blacks in House of the Dragon Season 1. We also know what will happen. It has a clear, definitive beginning, middle and end. There are of course multiple Blackfyre rebellions, all culminating in what we know as the War of the Nine Penny Kings, but I'm mainly talking about the very first Blackfyre Rebellion. It would just make sense to start with the very first one, even though a potential Duncan Egg show would probably start with the second one, but I'm talking about House of the Dragon, and it would make sense to show the Targaryens without their dragons, and that is what Ryan Condal said after all. It would be interesting to visit a time when the Targaryens didn't have access to that kind of power. Characters like Daemon Blackfyre, Bittersteel or Bloodraven are a match made in heaven for any TV show out there. And it is pretty well laid out. We know what happens, we are familiar with the big historic events during the time period. We know a fair amount about the characters involved, but there is also the possibility to do it differently. And that is where one of my favorite shows comes into play, or seasons, depending on where this goes. But I would love to see a show based on Bloodraven, and I would call it House of the Dragon, A Thousand Eyes and One. Imagine if House of the Dragon builds entire seasons around one of House Targaryen's most interesting characters, Brynden Rivers, aka Bloodraven. We would of course see him in a show about the Blackfyre Rebellion, which could introduce the character and open up the possibility of a standalone Bloodraven show. Bloodraven has all the makings to be one of TV's all-time great characters. An anthology series about Bloodraven, where each season depicts another segment of his incredible journey from being Hand of the King to going into exile. This show seems to write itself. That is kind of a book reader's wet dream. Bloodraven, I don't know how many theories about Bloodraven there are out there. He's just such a fascinating character. And of course, I mean, just look at the history of the guy. He went from becoming one of the great bastards of Aegon the Unworthy to being Hand of the King and the Spy Master and kind of effectively ruling the Seven Kingdoms for a while. And he had a huge impact on the Blackfyre Rebellions. He dealt with the Great Spring Sickness. He's a Greenseer with a loyal cult. And there's a lot to unpack. There are so many questions that can be answered. And to be fair, that is also what might be a problem with this show. It would be amazing. I would love to have Bloodraven as the centerpiece of the cinematic universe. You can't do a cinematic universe without this legendary character. But if you're looking at the situation right now, Bloodraven, and George actually just admitted this very recently, is a character that he has definitely problems with. He's struggling to write Bran's story in The Winds of Winter. And of course, Bloodraven, the three-eyed crow, plays a gigantic part in that. It might also just be too revealing, depending on where it goes. If we're looking at House of the Dragon Season 1, they pretty much answered all the questions we had. And that is actually something that I hope a Bloodraven portrayal, a live-action Bloodraven, doesn't have. But you know, some questions just don't need to be answered. It's adding to that whole thing. It's adding to the mystique surrounding this incredible character. So as you can tell, I am going back and forth with this. I'm not sure. I think Bloodraven is a character that definitely needs to be treated with a lot of care. There's a lot of possibility to really mess it up. So part of me really wants that show, and the other one is still healing from seeing live action Euron Greyjoy in Game of Thrones. Either way, it's a really exciting idea, I think, and along with Dunk and Egg, which is my #1 most wanted show ever, I think I want that show as well. The next show would be a show that could work as a one-off, 1 or 2 season spin-off. And that would of course be Aegon's Conquest, the very start of it all. We could follow the legendary Targaryen siblings conquer Westeros, and it could tell the story of how it all began. House of the Dragon pretty much opened up with Aegon's dream about the White Walker invasion, and this show could explore that. It is limited, as, let's be real, he just went from region to region and conquered, but the emphasis on the very foundation of the newly established feudal society in Westeros does make it intriguing. He is the legendary Targaryen, and we could learn so much in a show like that. An Aegon the Conqueror show is something that could definitely work. I mean, Aegon the Conqueror is name dropped a lot in Game of Thrones and in House of the Dragon, so even the more broader audience, the casual audience, knows him. That makes that whole introduction way more easy. That being said, I'm not sure if this makes for a compelling series. Sure, we would probably spend a lot of time on the very foundation of the feudal society, as I just said, how it was all built. What would maybe bring in that nuance is if they continue to the point where we have the first Dornish War. If we get to see that in live action, that would make for some opposition, pretty fair amount of opposition actually. Overall though, this is always going to be thrown into the mix when we're talking about House of the Dragon potentially being or becoming an anthology series. Aegon is just so legendary, and I think there's a fair chance that we might see him one day, but probably not next. Last but not least, what could follow that one up is a show about Aegon's son and successor, Maegor the Cruel, in what I would call House of the Dragon Reign of Terror. This show would of course be all about his atrocities, a story about what happens when a tyrant gains power in a feudal society. A tyrant that just so happens to have access to the biggest nuclear weapon in the world, Velaryon the Black Dread. Maegor was a monster, and this show would be the darkest of them all. Maegor the Cruel was a mass murderer, a kinslayer as well, and he pretty much killed everyone who opposed him. And that kind of begs the question, well, why would I want to watch a show like that? And we're all about great characters, right? We always tend to talk about how great characters fascinate us and how this is the very thing that makes this world so great. Like, it's good people that can turn into assholes at any given moment, and yet I'm talking about a Maegor the Cruel show and act like that is compelling. I would still love to see it, and even though Maegor is not very grey at all, I think He's a very intelligent character, and he actually played a big part in manifesting the Targaryen rule in Westeros. The Targaryens faced a lot of issues during that time, with the uprising of the Faith Militant, for example, that I could bring in some nuance. I've heard people talking about this show being too depressing, too dark, but I actually disagree because I think the payoff of such a show at the end would be massive. There's also a lot of mystery when it comes to the show, and as always, maesters telling tales. Well, Maegor had 3 Grand Maesters killed, so they're definitely not too fond of him. So there's always that to take into consideration. But again, the payoff of such a show would make up for it being very dark up until the very last few moments. Okay, so Maegor the Cruel, Aegon's Conquest, the Blackfyre Rebellions, and a show about Bloodraven. In my opinion, those 4 have the biggest chance to make it to the screen. So how could it work? Of course, hopefully not like many of the other cinematic universes out there. I don't want them to do it like Disney does it with Marvel and Star Wars, or even worse with AMC and The Walking Dead. I don't want that to happen with A Song of Ice and Fire, don't get me wrong. But I'm still very curious, and I'm going into this with an open mind. Before there even was talks about House of the Dragon becoming a thing, there was Blood Moon, the prequel set during the Age of Heroes about the First Long Night, which thankfully got cancelled. HBO lost $30 million just on that whole thing, on that one pilot episode alone. I gotta say I have a lot of respect for it. I have a lot of respect for HBO for choosing to not go ahead with it, at least for a season, just to get that money back. They really cared about quality here and chose another show, which proved to be the right decision. House of the Dragon, while not being perfect, is a very good show in my opinion, and it definitely managed to restore my faith in this whole thing. As mentioned before, HBO is already working on a few shows. Don't think all of them are going to make it to the screen. A few shows are animated and some of them are not even revealed yet. The likelihood of all of them getting picked up is very slim anyway, and I think we're not talking about something like Star Wars here. I don't think we're gonna have 4 or 5 shows running simultaneously. And we gotta remember, if House of the Dragon becomes an anthology series, you gotta change up the cast the entire time. You do 2 seasons with Aegon's Conquest, you need an entirely different new cast for it. And then the Maegor the Cruel one, you have to change people, or the Blackfyre Rebellions. It's not the same people, and that is very good in my opinion, because in that case, you don't run into that scenario where one character is in that show and you have to watch that show to understand this show. Just like with Book of Boba Fett and Mandalorian, for example. You are not forced to watch one show to understand the other. Multiple stories that can tell different tales, and I think that is way better from a storytelling perspective if each story really is treated like its own thing. Of course, Blackfyre Rebellion, if you do that in House of the Dragon, you have Bloodraven, so if he appears in a potential Dunk and Egg show, we already know him. But it's not like I won't understand Dunk and Egg if I didn't watch the Blackfyre Rebellion Part 1. Of course, I want quality over everything, and I have faith in HBO. In my opinion, they're the best when it comes to television shows. Maybe no one can pull off a cinematic universe, really, but if anyone can, HBO is definitely a front runner. And that is all I have for today. Thank you for watching, thank you for staying very patient with me. I won't abandon you anytime soon again. There's definitely going to be weekly uploads again, and this is only part 1 of 3. We're going to talk about other time periods and other stories that other shows could tell apart from House of the Dragon, and the podcast will also return. I sat down with Josh and George for an episode, and we also talked about this very topic, so definitely stay tuned. Thank you guys for watching. Subscribe if you didn't already. Take care and see us later.